Hey everybody, welcome to the Daniels on Research. My name's David Daniel.
I'm Daniel Willingham. This is the podcast where David and I read a research article each week and bring it to you, talk about what the implications might be for the classroom.
Or not. This week we're actually talking about a book, and our format's going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, is one of us reads the book and the other one doesn't. And fortunately, I never read books. So Dan read a very interesting book, and we thought we'd talk about it with you. What's the book, Dan?
That left it to me, absolutely. So it is this book, How to Educate a Citizen by D Hirsch.
Oh, D Hirsch. Okay, that's a very powerful name.
Yes, well known in education, absolutely.
Yeah, I actually have on my talks, I have my first slide when it just people are mulling and I'm not talking has quotes from him.
Nice.
Because he really takes things to task, and I think he thinks deeply about things.
He does think deeply, and he's also very direct. Though he doesn't necessarily think he's being very direct. I think it might be in the acknowledgments, it might be in the preface of this book. He says, "You know what? I'm 92. I'm tired of being polite. I'm just going to tell you what I actually think." And in his prior books, he is extremely forceful and direct. So when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really going to fasten my seatbelt here.
I really respect the directness. I'm really good at that, and that's why I'll never write a book, or because I don't have that many words. So let's start off with something. You know this guy.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to bring that up. So I'm doing this sort of book review, but I definitely, in the interest of candor, should say, yeah, I've known him for 20 years or something. He's a retired professor at the University of Virginia, where I teach. We met indirectly through UVA, and I was on the board of his foundation, and I would definitely call him a friend. So I'll be as direct and honest about the book as I can, but that's the background.
Perfect. And let's just talk a little bit about, it probably builds on his previous books.
Yeah, so let's several of his books, and the way that he really got famous was with a book called Cultural Literacy, which David, I of course know and many of our viewers and listeners will remember from the late 80s. So Cultural Literacy was this book that essentially argued central to reading comprehension is background knowledge. The extent to which you are successful in understanding an author's message is what you already know about the general topic that the text is about. And what Hirsch argued is, it's true that American kids don't read very well, and a lot of people think that, well, what we need to do is work on reading comprehension skills. And he was saying, if reading comprehension skills in that sense exist at all, they account for very, very little. And most of what our kids need is broader background knowledge.
And he came in with this idea before cognitive psychology kind of started putting the nail on that one, right?
I think that's really true. I went back and looked at cultural literacy again, and I had always thought he was sort of reporting on cognitive psychology. And there's a chapter in the book that is just straight cognitive psychology, but it was still kind of early. And when I think I started writing about this issue and the importance of background knowledge and comprehension about 2006, and have continued to, as I do, once I have an idea, I write about it a lot because I don't have that many ideas. And I realized that a lot of what I cite is post the late 80s. A lot of the most important evidence came out later. And so he was sort of piecing things together. It's not that there was no evidence on it at all, but it was the evidence base was definitely more slender. You're absolutely right.
So he was getting at this idea that the more you know, the more you can know. You can build knowledge, and the more background knowledge you have, the higher you could build.
That's right. And one of the things that made the book controversial was he took a step beyond that and didn't just say, the more you know, the more you can know. He also said, here's what you ought to know. Here are the kinds of things that to be a good reader in this way, it's called cultural literacies. Like, here we are in the American culture. Here's what it is assumed you will know to be a good reader if you live in the American culture. And crucially, the book had a list of 5,000 sort of common terms, events, things that Hirsch argued, and he said, like, this isn't a scientific list. This is just sort of my guess as to what those central ideas are. But that made the book enormously fun because you could buy the book and sort of see how many of them you knew and test your friends and all that kind of thing. And so Hirsch will readily tell you the book was an enormous bestseller, largely because of that list at the end of the book.
So Milton Bradley didn't turn it into a board game.
I don't know. That's something to be considered. We should do a GoFundMe for that. I think it's not too late. I think.
All right. So does this book evolve from that?
It sort of does, yeah. So there's still a great deal about knowledge in here. Knowledge is still central, and he talks a lot about the fact that American schools are not providing a coherent curriculum. So everyone always thinks like, oh, kids today, they don't learn how to think critically. All they're asked to do is memorize a bunch of information. What Hirsch would point out is that may or may not be true. It's certainly true that they don't seem to know a whole lot. And part of the reason for that is you put it beautifully, the more you know, the more you can know. Well, that indicates that as a text is in front of me, to the extent I'm going to understand it or not, depends on what I already know. So schooling, Hirsch emphasized, need to be really carefully sequenced. So a lot of the book points out there's not this systematic building of knowledge. The way you get that is from a curriculum that is a knowledge-rich curriculum and is very carefully sequenced. And instead, in most districts, what we have is the state sets standards, which isn't a curriculum, it's sort of targets for learning. They're very often kind of vague and they're kind of skill-based, and they're pretty weak on exactly what it is kids are supposed to be learning. So in that sense, we've heard this from Hirsch before. The thing that's really new is he's talking about another consequence that he argues we're going to see from this core curriculum, and that is that all of us Americans are going to feel more bound as a people. I mean, that's why it's called How to Educate a Citizen. He's talking about citizenship and what that.
So he's kind of saying that if we don't all have some things we know or value and can articulate and share with each other to pull us together, there might be no together.
That's exactly it. And of course, it seems extremely timely now when there's such division in the country. But he actually was talking about this. There's some similar ideas in a 2009 book he wrote, and this book really sort of evolves from that. But yeah, the idea is that because common knowledge is so important to communication, we are literally talking past one another, not really understanding each other very well if we have different knowledge, different cultural touchstones. So
does it have a list?
It doesn't have a list, so it's not going to be a bestseller, I'm afraid.
So there's no list of what we should. It's interesting though, because as someone who teaches a lot, what I've noticed, especially in the last 10, 15 years with the rise of Netflix and before that cable, is there's less and less I have in common in terms of references, at least, or examples with the people I'm teaching. The water cooler stuff is really, really difficult to get through because there actually is no common experience. For example, the Walter Cronkite experience from the 60s and 70s, things like that. We can't count on that.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing. Entertainment was such a cultural bonding experience when there were 3 networks and and it was all rigidly set by schedule. And now it's much more niche. There are a million networks. You can watch whenever you want to. People binge stuff. So yeah, you don't gather around the water cooler and talk about what happened on I Love Lucy last night.
And even the news.
Right.
So there's actually no common frame being pushed out there that we all can go have a conversation about, except the weather. That one's always a good one.
That's right.
Yeah.
Very offensive.
Is there any evidence that this argument actually would lead to something positive?
Right. I mean, that's what you would hope. And it's funny in thinking about it, when we were talking about the evidence within cultural literacy, and you brought up like how much cognitive psychology is there in that. it made me think, like, there's not a whole lot of direct evidence for this thesis. I would suggest, and I also feel a little uncomfortable saying that because I know I'm out of my area. I mean, we're getting into sort of political science and how it interacts with sociology, and I don't deeply know that. I don't shallowly know that literature at all, but I read the book. And I would say he's, so what he invokes arguments from sociologists, chief among them, Emil Durkheim, is very prominent, often thought of as sort of the person who founded the field of sociology. This was definitely a theme that Durkheim elaborated on and thought was really important. He points out that the founders thought that this was really important. Founders of this country were very concerned that, unlike other countries to which they were comparing us in Europe, we didn't have a common religion. We didn't have a common history and nationality. And so instead, we had people we were a nation of immigrants. And so the founders were very concerned about this idea. Everyone should feel like an American. They absolutely thought that common knowledge, common language, as learned in schools, was going to be essential to bind us as Americans. But the kind of direct evidence, I mean, this is a tough thing to get experiments on, right? It's sort of like, okay, Sweden, you look kind of dissembled. All of you are going to have common knowledge now in the next 20 years, and we see what happens, right? That's just not in the cards. It's going to be a lot trickier than that.
Yeah, that having common language is something we even talked about in Mind-Brain Education, right? The educators and the scientists don't share a common language, so the communication becomes very, very difficult.
Right. That's a great example. Yeah.
So where would this common, it still sounds kind of listy, right? So
yeah,
if someone's saying we should have some common knowledge that bind us together as Americans, it's very timely, like you said. I mean, most of us, not all of us, most of us believe 9/11 really happened and that pulled us together.
Right.
A lot less of us believe the pandemic's real, right? Or things like that. And that brings less of us together. It makes it hard to even act as a country. And then you add that to education, where I think you said this earlier, the decisions aren't even made at a national or even state level. It's really local level.
Right.
Texas gets together and decides what history will be in their textbooks and what history won't. Others, that California does, and but that makes it even harder to think about what would this culturally literate curriculum look like.
Right. Right. I think there are two pieces to what you're bringing up. One piece is this even possible? Is it completely unrealistic to suggest that we as a people are ever going to get together and agree on a curriculum? And there's a couple of ways of thinking about that. One is to say, you know what, if it happened at the state level, that would be a huge leap forward, even if the states came up with fairly different curricula. And you could imagine that some things are going to be much more controversial and much different. So we think of curriculum, we immediately think of civics, we think of history, but take math, take science. It's probably going to be easier to come together on those things. So I think is it possible question? Certainly it's going to be difficult, and Hirsch says quite explicitly, yeah, it's absolutely going to be difficult. It's absolutely the case that some people are, probably everybody's going to be at least a little bit sad and frustrated. But he suggests it's worth it anyway. If you do nothing, you're still, in a sense, doing something. You're still making a choice. And that's kind of where we are today. Not
only that, doing nothing, you're still doing something. You're doing something anyway. No matter what, there's curricula happening that are pushing forward cultural information. And this brings me back to what Skinner said, like Walden too. One of his arguments is people are being trained anyway, and it's kind of random and not purposeful. Why don't we realize that and put together a system that helps people develop into happy, functional, positive people, however that's defined. But it means we have to take charge of it and understand, so it has to be directed in order to have this happen.
Right. So for viewers or listeners who aren't familiar with Walden 2, this was Skinner's vision of sort of setting up rewards for certain types of behaviors, and people were horrified. It's inhumane. You're treating people like trained seals or something. And you gave a very good account of what Skinner's reply was, which is there are already rewards in the environment. We're just accepting that fact and being systematic about it. And I agree, exactly the same thing could be said in terms of curriculum.
So that brings it. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna just mention that the second part of this. So the first part of it is it even possible? The second part is, if you decide it's possible, who's going to pick the curriculum, which is what everybody thinks about, and or what should the curriculum look like? And this is where history really becomes important, because there is a fair amount of history in the book, and Hirsch points out there used to be a common curriculum, and it wasn't really set by the state. It was sort of a de facto curriculum. Actually, in the late 19th century, it was largely set by the McGuffey readers. People seldom know that outside of education, the McGuffey readers were second to the Bible only in America in terms of sales. These were this set of 6 readers, and many, many schools used it as the backbone of their curriculum. Now, the thing is, so Hirsch is sort of saying, like, we kind of used to have this, and then we don't have it anymore. But he's quick to also say, it's not that we want to go back to that. And this is the concern people have, which I think is certainly a legitimate concern. You start talking about one central curriculum, what's to prevent that from the people in power setting up that curriculum in such a way as to advance their power and ensure that they stay in power? So that old curriculum set by the McGuffey readers sanitized American history and was really a history and culture of white males in this country, and everybody else was either denigrated or sidelined. So that needs to be dealt with, and Hirsch acknowledges it as a problem and says, yes, of course. I mean, we need a new curriculum. But you could argue that that's, we need to do better. If we're going to expect people to take this idea seriously, we're going to have to really lead the way in showing what that might look like.
I think there's another issue backed off of that, though, because the who will always kill us. Once you start getting into this who, there's all these who's, right? And there's thing 1 and thing 2. But there's just all these people who are going to want to weigh in and have their thing in or out of there.
Yeah.
But another issue is, should it happen? There's a philosophy of education that is we're not put it this way. Education is something that we do to people for an outcome. Some people think it's to help them become who they're going to become, kind of self-actualized person, as opposed to someone who's been given the tools of society in order to be successful in society.
Right.
Right. And that is where the should argument would come out. Should we be saying these are the things people should come out of education with, or should education just give you the tools and let you kind of develop your passions and things independent of having to learn anything sometimes, right?
That's a great point. And it goes back to the cultural literacy piece. Hirsch absolutely feels that what school is for is to provide economic opportunity and opportunities within society. And even though the point got completely lost, because he was saying everybody should know who Herbert Hoover was, everybody should know all this stuff about dead white males. He was saying everyone should know that because that's where power resides in this country. It's not that knowledge is more important in any objective sense, but if you want to go to college and you want to end up economically prosperous, this is the kind of stuff that you need to know in order to be a good reader, and that's what's going to lead to your success. But you're absolutely right. That sets a particular goal for schooling that wouldn't necessarily be everyone's goal for what school ought to be teaching kids. And absolutely, I think the same thing is true here about how to educate a citizen. But Hirsch is more explicit about it in this book. He's saying this is, one of the goals of schools ought to be to make citizens of a country feel like they're citizens of that country, and to have something to say about what people in this country value.
So that moves it way beyond cultural literacy, the argument cultural literacy to a broader
Absolutely.
outcome. So is that why he thinks the core curriculum is no longer taught? Like, why isn't a core curriculum no longer taught if it was in these kind of out there anyway?
Yeah, historically. So
Yeah,
like, right, I was,
exactly.
okay. So his argument in the book, and there's a whole chapter in the book about this, he pegs this to really the schools of education, and says schools of education got um, obsessed with romanticism, with the capital R, sort of this view, this philosophical view of child development, whereby um, nature is becomes holy. And in his earlier life, before he was an educator, this was his expertise, was in romantic literature and romantic poetry. And so he invokes a lot of the philosophy and poetry of that age in sort of describing how people viewed nature. And the idea is that nature becomes holy, and so anything that interferes with nature is corrupting it. And the way that comes into child development is you want to leave the child alone and let the child grow naturally as nature intended for the child to grow. So and in fact, cultural institutions like schools are actually the problem. They're not the solution to the problem. So it's this very different view of childhood. And his argument is, this idea really caught on in schools of education and really never went away to the present day. And so his argument is that's why a common core curriculum fell out of fashion. It was incompatible with this view of childhood.
That's a great example of how how education is very difficult because it's so value laden. It can go with these arguments as opposed to with this data.
Right.
Right. And that those values can come from a society, they can come from the individual district, but you can't design education valueless. And he's actually saying that in a way that these are the values we should at least be focusing on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Does he offer any example curricula or anything out there that shows this is kind of what I'm thinking about?
So he barely mentions it in this book. In the prior book, The Making of Americans from 2009, there's actually an appendix that comes from the core knowledge curriculum. So when cultural literacy was this huge bestseller, he actually told me this story. He said, I turned to my wife and I said, well, we can be millionaires or we can try to actually do some good with this money. What should we do? And so they created a foundation that initially was devoted to trying to promulgate this idea of the need for a core curriculum. They finally realized if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. We need to have something we can hand people. And so they initially created a curriculum that had some resources associated with it. They eventually developed a reading program to go with it. And I'll put in a plug for them because I do admire one very important aspect of what they're doing. A lot of the materials that they've created can be downloaded free at their website, which I don't know, it's probably coreknowledge.org, to be honest. I don't know what it is, but they do. So they have tried to sort of make it easy for people to buy into this. They're also quick to say that this is one view, this is our view. Anything that sort of is sequenced and is knowledge rich would probably be happy for kids to do it. What we really object to is thinking that you don't really need knowledge, you just need to train kids with skills. We think that's impossible. And if it is knowledge rich, it can't be haphazard, it needs to be sequenced.
So overall, what do you think of the argument, the main argument in this book?
I don't really know what to think, candidly, because I was asked to blurb the book, and I did because I think it's an important argument to be having. I mean, the idea that all of us as citizens, through our institutions of government, should take a strong interest in what children are told about our history and about our culture, that seems sort of self-evident. And it's not Hirsch offers a particular view of what the consequences would be if we took that more seriously. So in that sense, I really like the book because I think it's a very important discussion to be having. Is he exactly right in his vision? This is pretty far outside my area, so I'm not really sure. He makes a case.
Well, and the case has been made in other areas, and other sorts of things. You have to have something to know if you want to teach someone to know. If you want to communicate, you have to have some common language to communicate. The interesting thing it's almost like, is it desirable to have a common curriculum or core curriculum given the potential for misuse by like you said, that the people who are in power? They always say that history is written by the winners. And I don't look at history as winners and losers. I look at it as all participants, right? So you can get it from the angle of each participant. But this would actually require some things to be privileged and some things to be more background.
That's right. And I mean, this is something that people absolutely, criticize this point of view or bring to this point of view, is they say, I don't trust the institutions we have to do this right. And I get that. I mean, I see where they're coming with that. And I don't have huge faith in saying, no, you're wrong. I think our institutions will do a fabulous job of this.
All right. Well, sounds like a great book. I think I might have to read it because of all the things you've said. I was hoping that you would tell me enough about it I wouldn't have to read it, but actually,
I do recommend it. And yeah, as I said, I'm not ready to say like, oh my God, we all have to, we've all got to start working towards this immediately. But it's absolutely a conversation we should be having.
Yeah, and D Hirsch's work is influential enough in education that it's something we should all know about. So the reason I thought this might be a good one for us to review, or at least talk about in this format, was because that kind of big thinking is necessary to push anything forward. And again, we're doing it anyway. Why not do it on purpose?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that's all I got. You got anything else?
No, I'm good.
All right, then, everybody. We'll see you next time. Welcome to our special edition of One Guy Read a Book.
Bye, everyone.